our technician.
I see.
He helps with all of the
Well,
sound
just move,
problems.
if the pillows are in your way, just
Oh, no problem.
toss them down.
So it's okay if you sit there? You want it to be closer because it's all contained?
Yeah, it's all her sound. I'm just monitoring over here and adjusting levels. So.
Awesome. All right. Well, once again, my name is Katya. I am a participant of a field school in Milwaukee this summer, but I'm not from Milwaukee, so this is a very new experience for me, and I found it very interesting learning the history of this neighborhood, especially the Villa Terrace. Before we begin, I do have to ask for a verbal consent of your voluntary participation in this study. Please know that there are no risks to participating in this. There are no real benefits except for enhancing the knowledge of this neighborhood of the Villa Terrace for the community, which is a wonderful goal. And also, this is not a confidential interview. We will be publishing what we are finding on our blog. We're going to hopefully be creating some documentaries, and we will be using names. And so if you are comfortable with that, if you can just state a verbal consent.
Surely, I give my consent gladly to the project.
Okay, thank you. And if you at any point wish to redact a statement or take something back, you can always contact our professor or Son. We will give you his contact information, and that will be no problem. Great. So just for introductions, would you mind stating your name and just tell us something about yourself?
My name is DelphineCannon. I am 87 years old. I have lived in Milwaukee since I was a year old, and I have been at Villa Terrace for about 40 years in one capacity or another.
Wow. How would you describe your relationship with the Villa Terrace?
Well, it's been one of sheer joy. It all began, I think, in about 1970, and a friend asked me to be a docent at the Milwaukee Art Museum because she knew I was interested in art and art history and all things beautiful. And I was especially interested in Villa Terrace, but to be a docent at the Villa, one had to become a docent at the Art Museum, and that entailed a class once a week for a year. And then we would do that in the morning, and then in the afternoon we'd have a class at Villa Terrace focusing on the decorative arts. And so that's how I grew to love Villa Terrace and became a docent at both places. And it was the education of my life, and I loved every minute of it.
Can you tell me a bit more about what you loved about this education?
About the education?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had not been an art history major, though I loved that, and I loved art, and we collected art. When we were married, we were always buying. You can see through the house some things. And so this gave me an art history course, really. And I kind of grew up. My father was a cabinet maker, and I was used to seeing around the house the furniture guides from the 18th century, and I thought nothing of them. But my mother would say, well, Frank, I think I like this time. And that might be Chinese Chippendale. Or the next time she'd take everything out, and then she would like Queen Anne tables. So all those names were so familiar to me, and I didn't think they were very special until I learned that those were the eminent cabinet makers of the 18th and 19th century. And I had grown up knowing those styles unbeknownst to me. So learning more about art just filled in all the many gaps, of course, I had in my education. And I loved giving tours, and some of the docents were a little nervous about giving tours to children and teenagers to keep their interest. But since I have 7 children, I was used to all the tricks to keep them interested and whatever. So I often chose to do those tours. And that was just lots of fun for me.
Definitely. I've had a lot of experience teaching younger children as well, as a piano teacher and also as a babysitter. So
Oh.
what are some of the tricks you use to kind of keep control, keep them interested?
Well, with with all ages, I think, you would bring them into the tour. You wouldn't lecture at them, as you know, and I might have them look for something, or who is the first one to find a red hat in a painting, or, silly little things like that. Or which one do you like the best, and do you think it's like any other one? Just to have them looking and being involved and not just standing there. And that seemed to work.
Were you able to share the Villataires with your own children?
Oh, yes. Our favorite Sunday afternoon thing was to visit the art museum. And so they grew up enjoying all the things I did, and then I was able to tell them more about it since I was getting to be so intelligent about art.
Those programs are wonderful.
And one of my daughters became an artist, and the rest of them are all pretty interested in art and antiques because they kind of grew up with that.
Would you say that you having grown up with a lot of this information, a lot of the language used with new art, styles, furniture styles, you and your husband both wanted your children to have the same exposure?
Yes, yes. And I remember we always collected Persian rugs. You can see them around the house. And when my first son went off to college, he wanted to take one of the rugs to his college dorm. And I said, oh, I don't think so. And he just took it as a matter of course. It wasn't special. He'd grown up with them and he liked them and he wanted one in his college room. And you know how some college rooms are at the University of Madison, or some of the homes they lived in were not too well kept up. So he was very disappointed, but he didn't go off with a Persian rug.
What was the name of your husband, and what did he do?
My husband was John, and he was an attorney, and he practiced in the neighborhood on North and Farwell, across from the bank. And he was a very interesting man with many facets, and he was a real people person and a historian. Nothing new ever happened in Milwaukee that we didn't go to see it. A new building, a new roadway, whatever. He kept me focused on what was going on. And he was very good about, he got to be more interested in art because of me, and I got to be more interested in other things because of him. And if we'd travel, we'd have sort of a point system. We'd go to a museum, and then he'd say, well, I think that was 2 points. Now, you have to go and see some engine house somewhere. So that was how we worked out our mutual interests.
That's funny. And you said you have lived in Milwaukee since you were 1 year old.
Yes.
And your husband?
Yes, he was also born in Milwaukee.
How do you feel about Milwaukee as home in the community?
Oh, I just love it. I can't imagine being anywhere else. 5 of my children are scattered around the country, but I could not imagine living in any of their locales.
Where do they live?
I have 1 in San Francisco, 3 in Florida, and 1 in New Jersey.
Do they come to visit often?
Yes, they're very good about that. My daughters usually come twice a year, and we get together a lot. Last year we had 2 weddings. one in San Francisco and one in Florida. So everybody went, every child, grandchild, and cousins. We always turn out. So that was like having two family reunions. But if nothing like that comes up, every other year we have a big family reunion and everyone comes, and there are probably 28 of us now in my immediate family. So we choose, we've been to Tucson, we've been to the Outer Banks, we've been up to northern Wisconsin, and we get a lot of housing to accommodate all of us. And then we reune for a week. So yes, I see them all often.
That's great. Do they also feel the same way about Milwaukee in terms of what is new? They're always very excited to know what is new here.
Yes, they love Milwaukee, and they keep track of the Packers and the Brewers and the basketball team, and they're very proud of having grown up here, and it's dear to their hearts.
Since you have spent most of your life here, can you tell me a childhood memory of the city? Because there must have things that have changed or something that is unique from your childhood.
I don't have a lot of memory of my childhood, unfortunately. I had a couple little, I suppose, mini strokes, and that seemed to have wiped a lot of memory. But when I just said baseball now, I remember my father taking me to Borchard Orchard, and that was what we called Borchard Field when the Brewers were a minor league team. And he was a great baseball fan, and so was my mother. And I remember going with him to Borchard Orchard and watching baseball. And that's an old Milwaukee memory.
What did the Villa Terrace look like when you were younger?
Pretty much the same as it does now. In fact, when my husband and I were married and we didn't have two nickels to rub together because he was starting law practice, and that takes a bit to build. And we would walk or bike before we had our first child, and we would go to Villa Terrace and decide that was the kind of house we would like to live in. That was our favorite, and we always called it our house. And so it was so providential, perhaps, that I ended up working at Villa Terrace for 40 years. It was, he was always tickled about that.
What is your favorite facet of the house? Or if that were to be your house, what is the one thing you really wanted?
Oh, I've seen, so we have a wonderful video that usually plays most of the time during visiting hours. I don't know if you've seen that, but it shows the original family, the Smiths, and they would flood the back terrace overlooking the lake in the winter and turn it into a skating rink. And the video shows them having so much fun. Mrs. Smith is pushing a chair to skate because she's not a good skater. And Mr. Smith has a great big raccoon coat on. And the kids are all skating around. And it was such a fun house then. And in the front, one Christmas, Mr. Smith had a vehicle built. And it was like a little train or trolley, but it was on wheels. And the kids would climb aboard it, and it would go around the front courtyard with all the kids hanging out from the top. And so I always thought it was such a happy family house, and they used it for the children. And I like that idea, and I like the idea that at Christmas time, or Christmas Eve perhaps, they'd be gathering in the dining room for dinner, and Santa Claus was coming down the chimney in the Great Hall. And so at the proper time, I suppose there was a knock, the children rushed into the Great Hall, and Santa was just leaving, and there were all the gifts at the tree. And that was one of the stories that Mrs. Smith told us. And so I like that idea of it being a real family house.
So you have met Mrs. Smith.
Yes, yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, we met her many years ago when she came back to Milwaukee. She was married 2 more times after Mr. Smith died. And so there are many things at the villa with little plaques that say, gift of Mrs. Curtis, and that was the name when she gave the villa to the art museum. And she was a tiny little woman, probably my height, 5 feet or less. And she was just charming. And when after Mr. Curtis died, and she came back here, she lived in the Cudahy Towers. And she tried to give the villa to the county, and they would not accept it. Now, do you want this kind of history?
Yeah, I'm curious.
Because there was no endowment with it, and they didn't know how they would maintain it. So finally, she thought of the art museum, and the art museum accepted it. And so she was very happy. And her children and grandchildren are still involved. When we formed a board and got things organized, we reached out to the Smith family, and they were delighted. I can remember inviting them all to lunch, and we met them all, and they were just delighted that something was going to be done to the villa, and it was going to be open to the public. And so they're very much involved today with Villa Terrace. But she was darling. She told us the Santa Claus story, and then at Easter time, she gave all her grandchildren baby rabbits, baby chicks, much to the consternation of their mothers and fathers, because then they had to take care of them. So that wasn't too successful a gift, she said. But while they lived there, they kept chickens down in the garden and had coops for them. And that was, again, for the children's delight.
Where there are statues now.
Yes. You see, the Friends Board, decided to reclaim the gardens that you see now. That was just a jungle of dying trees, and you could not see the house from the lake. And so to enhance the villa and to encourage more memberships in the villa, we raised $1.8 million privately by ourselves. We did not ask the county. The county owns the grounds, and the county owns the villa. But they don't have the money to maintain it. So that's why 20-odd years ago we formed a Friends Board, and that was to administer the villa, to raise money, to have docents' tours, everything that goes with making it a public entity. And so we raised this money and had tons of wonderful volunteer help. We discovered there are so many gardeners in Milwaukee, and so we got lots of volunteers who would come every Saturday morning. Husbands would bring their saws, and so most of the tree cutting in this jungle was done by volunteers. Then the county got interested when they saw that we weren't going to ask them for money, and they did some very wonderful things. They would supply a truck so that at the end of a work day, the logs and everything could be carried away to a spot that was proper. And then they began to repair. The roof needed a lot of work. The electrical system needed a lot of work. So they stepped in and did some of the work. So then we had a nice working partnership. And we created what you see now, this perfectly beautiful 16th century Italian garden. Italian gardens were symmetrical, and you see how ours is so symmetrical with the allays of trees and the water stairs. We soon hope to have the koi back in the pond. We need to repair the water stairs and get the water running again and put the fish there as it was originally. But this was all done by wonderful volunteers, and they still come and have work days, several in the summer, to prune and plant and do everything that was needed. Then the hill is an orchard of many crabapple trees, and we decided to write to every bride who had had a wedding there or a reception and ask them to buy a tree. And I don't know what it was. Was it $90? I'm not sure. $50, something like that. And I know my daughter had her rehearsal dinner there, so she sent her some. And then we had a plaque listing, we call it the Bride's Orchard. And we listed every bride who had purchased a tree. And we did get enough money for all the trees and their maintenance thereafter. So that was how we kept raising money for this wonderful garden that you see now. But without the volunteers, we could never have done it. Milwaukee really turned out to help. And then we had a wonderful partnership with Growing Power. Are you aware of Will Allen?
No.
And Growing Power? Well, he's a wonderful man who has started, he has the only farm in Milwaukee on the Brown Deer Road. And he started showing inner city people how to grow vegetables. And his aim was to have every vacant lot turned into a vegetable garden. And so he grows vegetables in innovative ways on his farm. A couple of years ago, he was awarded the MacArthur Prize of $1 million, which was absolutely wonderful. And very rare that he's not just a gardener now, he's famous, I think, nationally and internationally because of his innovative plans for growing vegetables and improving the nutrition of people who can't afford to go to Sendik's, let's say. And he wants everyone to eat nutritiously and to grow their own food. And he has a fish farm there, and he cultivates worms. And, but I won't go on and on about Will Allen, but he would be wonderful to talk to someday in another project.
Certainly. You mentioned just before Growing Power just how much Milwaukee really came out to help restore and clean up everything at the Villa Terrace. Can you tell me more just about this community collaboration and how the neighborhood worked together, or how it improved or really solidified the relationships within this community?
Well, going back to Growing Power, we invited inner city kids to come and work in the garden. And Will Allen, I think, chose them, and they loved it. And they would come in the morning, and our volunteers would teach them how to weed, how to prune, how to do simple things. And then they'd have lunch with the volunteers, and then we had transportation to get them back home. And I would be so thrilled if I were there on a Sunday afternoon and see children with their parents. And for inner city children, unfortunately, this was a treat to come to this big house that they considered a mansion. And I guess it is a mansion, isn't it? I mean, they hadn't the opportunity sometimes to do things like that. And to see this house overlooking the lake, this beautiful setting, and to think that they were helping, they were there and helping with the garden, and then bringing their parents to see what they had done. So that I thought was a wonderful outreach. And we encouraged tours, so lots of garden clubs from all the nearby states heard about this garden because it's the only 16th century style Italian garden in the Midwest. And so if you're studying garden architecture, you see the symmetry. There aren't a lot of flowers in Italian gardens. They rely mostly on greens and different shades of greens and textures and different kinds of trees. So I think every garden club in a 3-state area brought a tour to see our garden, and then they would donate. They were so tickled to have this here. And so we encouraged tours, and we had a lot of garden tours, and we would let all our city garden clubs know about it, encourage them to come with their neighbors. And so the interest grew and grew, and many who toured, we would always ask them if they were interested in helping us, either as garden workers or as volunteers, docents, whatever. And we had a docent class to train people to give the tours. And so it was not just an East Side project. We had people interested from all over the city, West Side, South Side, whatever. And that helped because many people had walked past Villa Terrace if they lived on the East Side, but it looked like a house, and we can't have signage. So there was a very unobtrusive sign, Villa Terrace Decorative Arts Museum, but I don't know how many people really saw that. So it increased, and then the media got hold of it, so there were lots of interviews, and lots of the radio and TV stations came and publicized it. So the interest in it grew and grew. And the Friends Board maintains the garden. The county does not help us now at all. And we need a gardener. And so it costs $50,000 or $60,000 a year to maintain that garden. And we raise that money on the Friends Board to maintain the garden so that it will be a gift to Milwaukee forever.
What kind of things do you do for fundraising?
Coming up in July is our largest fundraiser, and it's a gala, a dinner on, I should know the date, but I don't. And it's $250 a person. And we have a silent auction upstairs in the Great Hall and on the patio. And then they set up an enormous tent, and we have a glorious dinner, just a wonderful dinner. And then after the dinner, there's dancing and a live auction. And so that's our biggest fundraiser. And that is what really supports the garden. So we're working very hard now. The economy isn't as good, and our tickets aren't coming in as quickly as we would like. So our goal is usually to make $50,000 that night, because we look for sponsors too, to underwrite the food, the whole thing. And we really need to make that a success, because that's our big garden maintenance fundraiser. And we have other smaller ones during the years. There are two entities. There's the museum and there's the Friends Board. And the museum has some activities to raise money. And then the Friends Board has activities. One thing we do, it doesn't really raise money, but I was there on Sunday. We have a wonderful music series all summer. Every Sunday we have musicians in the outer courtyard, and there's a coffee man who has coffee and pastries, and it's free of charge. And we started that years ago to encourage membership, because once you're there, you love it. And so people bring the Sunday paper, and we put up lots of chairs in the courtyard, and it's very casual. You read the paper, you chat, you listen to the music, and you have a muffin and coffee. And we have usually around 150 people in and out every Sunday.
That sounds fun.
But it is fun. Come some
I'll
Sunday,
come to Sunday.
from 10 to 1. Then if you wish to enter the museum, then you must pay the admission fee or be a member. But to be out there is no charge.
How great. That's a wonderful idea.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned just now that there are the two entities, a museum, and then you have the Friends Board.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak more to the relationship between the two, how you work together, or whether you have different agendas, or what your goals are?
Well, I think we have different agendas, and I'm not sure I really want to speak to that. But our goals are to enable Villa Terrace to be here forever. And there is a dual board. We are connected to the Charles Alice. I don't know if you knew that. We're operated together. We're one entity. The Charles Alice Museum and Villa Terrace Museum are under one board. And but I think that's another story.
Do you do any work at the Charles Alice Museum?
No, I have always just been at Villa Terrace. From being a docent, before there was a Friends Board. You see, the Art Museum used to administer Villa Terrace. And Barbara Brown Lee, who just retired as the Curator of Education, was the curator at Villa Terrace. And she gave the classes and saw to it. But then the Art Museum divested itself of Villa Terrace, and we became an independent entity, and Barbara had to withdraw. And then an administrator was appointed. The first one was Ann Donovan, and she was that was a paid position, and then she gave the classes and took care of the exhibitions. And there was Ann Cole who did it until she died, and then they had several administrators until Barbara decided that it needed its own board, and that was in 1990. Barbara called me to come to a meeting, and Beth was there, Beth Chapman, whom you're interviewing, and 3 other people, and we formed the first board. So we would then administer and take care of the villa. And we did that. I think 20 years. I have a wonderful colored photo in my front hall that was given to the original members of the board. as a thank you. You'll like to see that. It's
Yeah.
stunning. And
I'd love to see that.
anyhow, so we've had the board for 20 odd years. But that was how it all began. So now as I say, we're no longer attached to the Art Museum, but we have a good working relationship with the Art Museum. And Laurie Winters came over and lent us paintings, and because in this division, some things went back to the Art Museum, but I don't want to get into that. But now we have a very nice working relationship, and I hope we will have a curator soon. The manager has decided that this year we have 4 exhibits a year, and they will be curated by a different person. But we really need our own curator, because staging exhibitions is a big job, and that's what keeps people coming, because they want to see something new, and an exhibition does that. Along with just the beauty and grandeur of the place and its history, because the history of it is most interesting. And, you can talk for an hour or more just on the who was responsible for the beautiful cabinetry, the painting, the this and the that. It was... are you interested in that at all?
Well, I was just about to say I come from a little bit of a museum background, and so I do know just how complicated organizing exhibits can be, and how the whole selection process is all very political. And the fact that there are several homes, at least that I visited abroad, that have been turned into museums, very wonderful places of residence that now are exhibiting artwork and things like that. So it is very nice for me to see that there is something like that here in the States, in Milwaukee.
Yes.
But the paintings are not original, right? They keep coming from the art museum?
Oh, they're all original paintings. No, they
But
were
original to the house, I'm
No,
sorry.
no. There are 2 that are original to the house.
Which ones are those?
They're on the west wall, and they had been. We found them in the state capitol in Madison, and they were brought back to Villa Terrace, and they are original to the house. Most of the furniture that you see is original to the house. Some of it is antique, some of it is reproduction, but it was all there. I can't think of the name of the architect, which is terrible. It's always on the tip of my tongue. David Adler, thank you. This is the only David Adler home in Milwaukee. He had his first offices here on Prospect Avenue, but then he moved to Chicago. And so there are a lot of David Adler homes in Chicago, but we're the only one here. And when the Smiths engaged him, they had 2 pieces of property, one out in Fox Point and this one. And he said, no, I will build you a house on this one, because he said, I will build you a Mediterranean villa overlooking the sea. And they named it Sopra Mare, over the sea. And what David Adler said, you did. And so they got an Italian villa, because that was what he thought was most suitable for the space. And he was unusual, as you may know, because he did everything, and that was his hallmark. He not only drew the plans, but he did, or his sister in some cases, did the landscape architecture, and they chose the furniture that would suit the house. And that was unusual for an architect to do in those days, and still today, I think. And so he did go to Italy and found some of the furniture there. It was at a time after the war, and the Italians were impoverished, and they were willing to sell some of their things. So there's a wonderful big bread cupboard in the front hall that's original, that was bought in Italy and shipped. And all of the tiles are Italian that you see. In the front courtyard, it's stones from the beach at Lake Michigan. Mrs. Smith's story was that she had the children go to a park in Fox Point that had black and white stones and fill their pails so they could at least help. So the front courtyard is made of stones from our beaches.
That's great. And I do know that the beach was included as a part of the original property, and then it was turned into the public beach.
Yes.
Tell me what the experience is like to be on the beach that low down looking up at this magnificent house.
Well, it's magnificent now. And because, as I said before, you couldn't see the house because of this jungle. And now you have this wonderful, clear view. And when the Smiths built the house, Lincoln Memorial had not been there. So that was why their property went to the water, because that road was not there. It's hard to believe that it wasn't there, because it's been there as long as I can remember, I think. But they must have had a wonderful time going down the hill and out to the water. You know, it was, even though it's so impressive, as I keep saying, it was a family house, and they treated it as such. So they must have had wonderful times.
Certainly. Do you have any memory of what kind of celebrations or parties would happen there? Or gatherings?
Yes, their daughters had they were all debutantes, and they had their debut parties there. And I can just see all the trees strung with little lights, and we have a lot of photos on the video of parties there. Not only the debut parties, but other summer gatherings that they would have outdoors. And it just looks wonderful. And it's such a great place to have a party. And can't you just imagine all the lights and those wonderful old cars driving up, all those Packards and elegant old antique cars.
So were those parties very neighborhood gatherings? Would everyone come and join?
Well, if the neighbors were friends, I think. I don't know that they had a big family. Mrs. Smith had several sisters and brothers, and so did Mr. Smith. So just their own family made a party. And people, when I first began there were people who said, "Oh, I've been to a party at the Smiths." So apparently they loved giving parties, and there were many of them.
It's a wonderful thing to try to imagine in your mind what that might be like. All I can think of is The Great Gatsby.
Yes, that's just the era, because it was built in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. So that's the era, and a couple of times for this gala fundraiser, which happens every other year, we've had antique vintage cars parked in the drive with their owners, just delighted to tell all about them. And then as the guests come in, they can have their picture taken next to these wonderful old cars. And one time we had a 20s party as a fundraiser, and the cars were there, and we asked people to come dressed in that style, and they did. And they found all the 20s dresses, the straight line and knee length and fringe, kind of a shimmy fringe. So that party was lots of fun. Lots of turbans or cloche hats. And that was a great, great evening.
Wow.
Now, am I going on too long?
No, well, do you want some water?
No, I'm fine. But just tell me
We'll do a time check when Stephen gets
Oh,
back.
okay.
But,
Because I tend to ramble
those are great
without
stories.
notes.
I love it. Yeah, you mentioned that you didn't get a chance to review any notes. You don't
Well,
even need them.
I can't, I can't see them.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned earlier that really interested me, you were saying, once you get people there, I think this was in reference to the Sunday gatherings now, once they're there, they love it. And as a docent, I'm sure you have heard many different opinions on what exactly it was that different groups of people were caught their fancy, or what parts of the house really attracted people.
Well, I think they're enchanted with the whole story of it that I would tell. And I have never had anyone who didn't love it and praise it and rave about it and say, we never knew this existed. And it's so much fun to go through a mansion, it's often called, because they don't get that opportunity. And there are grander ones, what's the wonderful one on Wisconsin Avenue? Another historic home. But it's, I think, 3 stories, and it's much grander. I like this because it's grand without being ostentatious, don't you think?
Yeah, I do.
And I think people feel comfortable in it, and they like that they can feel, and they'd say, oh, I just love, wouldn't it be wonderful to live here?
I think it feels like a family home.
Yes,
And
it does.
Even though it is very large and it has this extensive garden, it's family oriented, and I think that's what attracts people.
And there are so many stories. I'd always tell them Lloyd Smith was the president, and his father before him, and now his sons, of A.O. Smith. The company
Yes.
that is still in existence, and they made water heaters and boilers and chassis of cars. And since he was a very inventive engineer, he had a turntable in the garage. And so when he drove his car in at night, he pressed a button and it turned round so he could go out facing the front.
Wow.
And in the basement, they had, I suppose you could call it one of the first dryers. It was a great big receptacle that hung from the wall, from the ceiling, and was heated. And so the laundress would put the clothes in it. It did not tumble them, but it dried them. So that was very inventive for the time.
Wow.
And David Adler really copied. He did not copy a 16th century Italian villa, but he created one in the style of allowing for family living. And we had a terrible fire some years ago, and so some of it has all been redone, but in the Great Hall, there's a wonderful Pecky cypress ceiling, and it has a wonderful stenciled border on the beams. And that was all hand done. And then it had to be refurbished because of the fire. And the floor, David Adler just insisted on the finest of anything. Even in the servants' quarters, everything is custom made. And the floor had wide planks with pegs, hand pegged together rather than nailed together. But that whole floor had to be replaced. So that's not the original floor, but they used wide beams and pegs, but I suspect there's a little more nailing done than it was originally. And the cabinet makers were the finest cabinet makers in Milwaukee at the time, and they were responsible, for the library, and any of the woodwork is just beautifully done because that was his style.
The fire happened about 10 years ago?
I think it must be, is it that long? I'm not sure, but you can find that, yes. And in the dining room, it's a pecky cypress ceiling, but it's whitewashed white to kind of lower it a bit and make it look like a more comfortable dining room. And
How did the fire happen?
well, we were having work done to refurbish it, and they were using, which should never have been done in a museum, the painters were using an electrical device to remove the paint on the shutters, I think, or on the window trim. And that never should have been done. It should have all been hand scraped, because you don't use that in a museum. And apparently a spark, though they turned it off and went off to lunch, a spark started it. And it went right up to the second floor, and a neighbor or a passerby noticed something and called the fire department. So in that lunch hour, it just did dreadful damage. We have a room upstairs that had magnificent wallpaper, which was hand blocked, and took many processes of hand blocking to get all the colors. And through some miracle, the company in Paris, no, it wasn't Paris, it was in Italy, still had the wallpaper after all those years, since the 1920s. So they were able to repaper it at a tremendous cost, but it's a little different color than it was originally, but it's the same magnificent wallpaper. And Jackie Kennedy used this wallpaper in the White House when she was redoing.
Really?
She went to the same source in Italy, so that was always a fun story.
That's great. I didn't know that.
And you see, now I forget what the question was.
Oh, no, just details on the fire. I think. Were
Oh,
most of the other things that had to be replaced during the fire, were they equally difficult to find?
yes. Of course, a restorer, everything went to a restorer because there was a lot of damage, and it was smoke damage. And I guess one doesn't realize what the smoke does. So all the paintings had to be restored. And lots of the furniture had to be restored. And I can't remember now. I think we lost a couple of pieces that were beyond restoration. But luckily, I think the insurance company took care of everything. And so we were quite fortunate. Except that you don't have the original floor and the original this and that.
One thing I wanted to go back to quickly, you mentioned that your Villa Terrace is in the style of an Italian villa, not a copy, in
Yes.
order to allow for family. And what can you elaborate on that more?
Well, an Italian villa would not have had a dining room with chairs. The dining room came in maybe the early 18th century. And in the Italian villa, they would bring up benches to eat and put up a trestle table. And it wouldn't be permanent necessarily. They'd put it up for the meal. And because actually in the 16th century, only the men had chairs with arms. The women sat on stools. We've come a long way, haven't we, Katya?
Yes.
And so to have a permanent table and chairs was not what you would have seen in the 16th century. In fact, I don't know if it's still in the front hall, perhaps not. We had a bench that opened up for storage, and that would have been used for seating for the women. So that isn't authentic. And of course, the bedrooms were all, had beds and dressers and mirrors, and you wouldn't have found that in an Italian villa. There would have been far fewer furnishings.
Have you always been interested in Italian styles, or was this something that once working at the Villa Terrace you really got into it?
Yes, I wasn't. During that time, I also started an antiques business when my last child was in first grade. And so in that business, I really had mostly English and Oriental antiques. So Italian style was not familiar to me until there. But I was just always interested in research and history. And so this all kind of flowed together in having another career when I was older. And so that antiques business was wonderful. And it tied in with everything that I had learned. And when I would do an exhibit at a show, every piece generally had a little card, and I would date it and tell you what it was. So that was my research phobia. I wanted people to know what everything was and its history. So my volunteer work and my business all worked together beautifully.
You're a natural docent. You said a new career. What was your career before?
When I graduated from college, I was in advertising. I was a copywriter in the first days of television, and that was fun. And I did that until my first child was born.
Okay.
So, but that all helped, the writing part. I always liked to write. So that also tied in.
Wonderful stories. I think, do you have any other side story or some additional memory to conclude?
Oh, not really. Your questions are so helpful because, as I say, without my notes, I was just lost and very nervous about this because I thought, what will I remember? But you're such a skillful interviewer that it went very well.
I'm very nervous.
Oh, you are. I was the one who was nervous. I couldn't wait till it was over. But you did just beautifully. You asked very incisive questions, and you follow up on something I had rambled about, and that's very good.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, well, thank you.
Maybe something that I'm just curious about. Has your family ever had any personal functions at the villa?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, yes, we had my youngest daughter's wedding reception there.
Right.
Because her husband, when you asked me about liking Milwaukee, her husband is from the East, and he absolutely loves Milwaukee. And Claire was so happy that he liked it so much because then she knew they'd visit often. Well, he was crazy about it, and he couldn't wait to have all his friends come to the wedding. He just thought it was the most wonderful city he'd ever discovered, and he had traveled widely. And he loved the architecture, and he had his friends all rent bikes and take a tour of the East Side. And he loved Villa Terrace. He couldn't believe that we could have a rehearsal dinner in such a wonderful place. So, and then I also had my 80th birthday party at Villa Terrace. And that was absolutely wonderful. My children talked me into it. And I think we had 125 friends and family. And it was May 20th on my birthday, so the weather was perfect. And we could be outside on the terrace as well as inside. And all the children who were there, and there were lots, were all romping down in the garden you know, going to the secret gardens in the corners and romping around, and it was such fun to look down at them. They were having so much fun.
Wow.
So yes, I've had 2 private parties there.
You must have gotten special treatment too, being so involved in the Villa Terrace.
Well, everybody was very nice to me, yes. But it was just a wonderful party. And people still talk about it. And it's because of the ambiance of Villa Terrace. They'll say, oh, I remember that party. How long ago was it? Well, it's 7 years ago now. I can't believe they still remember it.
That's great. Why don't, if you don't mind, can you show me that picture you were talking
Surely.
about? What is it?
And let's see, what time is it? How?
Time is 11:15 a.m.
Oh, 11:15. Well, I'm sure Beth is still rambling too. We are ramblers, both of us.
Storytellers. We're still connected, but I'm holding the piece.
Oh, I'll
Don't
be
get worried
quiet.
if there's some strain.
I want Katia and you to see this photograph.
So this was how did you get this again?
This was a gift to the 3 of us who still remain of the original Villa Terrace board, founded in 1990. So isn't that wonderful? I just love it. So Beth got one, and I got one, and Al got one. And now, are they still interviewing or chatting?
Are you finished or? Okay, yeah, I think they are done. Is your tape still running?
No, I didn't go into that either.
Into the Amish and these.
Oh, at the villa you used to have like the federal room.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, they used to do that.
But then, well, the federal room is still there,
Yeah.
pretty much intact, but the other furniture had been moved back to the art museum. So we don't,
You can feel free
But
to
the
sit
shaker
down right
room
there.
went back. People always miss that shaker room.
yes, and all the shaker furniture went back.
Yeah, well, what was in the Colnick rooms before the Colnick stuff was there?
That is maybe the shaker room.